Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thanks so much for joining. My name is Helena, and I'm joined here by the rest of the Restless Brussels team, as well as our guest for today. Before I briefly introduce him, just a shout out to Euractiv, who kindly offered to host this event and allowed us to do this via live stream. So thanks so much as well. Now, some of you might remember or recognize Anthony because we, before the summer, did an event with him, likewise a post-election analysis, but this time around, the focus, of course, is on the outcomes of the local elections. Anthony, for those of you who are not familiar, is the president of Democracy, which amongst others aims at improving citizen participation and governance. And he's also an active participation in Belgian politics. And we're very grateful that he made time to join us from Strasbourg this evening. As you might have been able to deduce from the event invitation, the focus today, even if a couple of weeks after the local elections took place, is to kind of the outcomes, to identify some trends, and then most importantly, to also get for you to have a chance to ask some questions and share some reflections. So we're going to be doing this in about an hour, and with that in mind, Anthony, over to you for your insights and analysis.
Thank you very much. It's really great to be here again. I apologise in advance, I have a slight cold, so if I come across a little bit croaky, that's why. It's also really interesting to analyse the Brussels communal election results. I'm going to go through, for those people who are not 100% familiar with how this stuff works, who the parties are, what the process was, what happened in the different communes, not in a huge amount of detail, focusing on the ones where there's still total chaos, and then a few of the big lessons that we learned. So just to start, for those who aren't super familiar with the way that elections are run in Brussels, at local level, parties often create lists together. So they tend to fall into the main political families. So there's from the left to right, the farthest left is PTB, or PvdA in Dutch, and that's the Workers' Party, Communist Party. Then next to them, going from left to right, you have the PS in Francophone Belgium and Vooruit in Dutch-speaking Belgium, and those are the two socialist parties, and they often, but not always, go in on lists together. Then a little bit to the left of them, or maybe to the right of them, because they're a new party, is a party called Team Fawad Aidar, which was founded by a former Vooruit member who has been pushing very much issues related to the Muslim community, issues around Gaza, did pretty well in the national elections, as we'll see, did all right, but not amazingly in the local elections as well. Then a little bit further towards the centre, you have the party called Défi, which used to be the Fédération des Francophones, and as you can tell from the name, was originally about defending the rights of French speakers in Brussels, and particularly in the suburban Brussels. And they have been going through a major internal party division, which we'll talk a little bit talk about a bit in a minute. But they are still present in the Brussels scene. Then in the centre of the centre, you have the former Christian Democrat Party, which is called on the French-speaking side Les Engagés, and on the Dutch-speaking side CDV, Christelijk Democrat and Vlaams. And then in the liberal position, you have Mouvement Réformateur (MR), and on the Flemish side, Open VLD. And then in the Flemish nationalist camp, you have N-VA, the New Vlaamse Alliantie, which is a kind of mainstream nationalist party, if there is, that's how you can describe them, but certainly to the right of centre. And then to the farthest right, you have Vlaams Belang. So those are the parties, with a couple of exceptions, that stood in Brussels. But it's all a bit more complicated than that, because the way that Brussels elects is that you have a list system. So if you went to vote, you'll see that you were able to vote for any list and as many people on that list as you liked. And the reason that those votes are important is that the list is established in order by the parties. But if you get lots of personal preference votes, voorkeurstemmen, then you can move up the party list. So, for example, in the last elections, one of the candidates in Bruxelles-Ville was 49th on the list, in last place, known as the list pusher, the list doer. And they got pushed all the way up into an electable position because they had such strong personal support that all of their personal votes counted, and they pushed somebody else out of a seat and took that seat themselves. So the other reason that parties clump together in these alliances, which is sometimes called just PS Vooruit or PS Vooruit Plus or MR Open VLD Les Engagés CDMV Plus in some of the more complicated ones, is for the simple reason that the electoral counting system, the allocation of seats, uses a very odd method called imperiale, which is like halfway between majority and proportional representation. It was devised in the 1920s when the vote was extended to all people of all men of working age in Belgium. And at that point, they wanted to reduce the number of parties, reduce the risk that like socialist movements would take seats. And so they created this system called imperiale, named after the guy who invented it, which gives large blocks more power. So in a proportional election system, you would get exactly proportional numbers of seats. In the imperiale system, bigger parties get more. The idea being to create more stability. As we will see, stability has not always been created. So that's the system, that's the way it works. The idea, apologies, as I say, I have a cold. So the idea behind the local elections is to do two things. It's obviously to elect the Conseil Communal, and that's what sets the budget, takes the big decisions, passes legislation. But from the Conseil Communal, you elect a burgemeester, the person who is in charge of the commune, the person who leads the collège, and a group of échevins or schepen, who are the people who are responsible for particular roles. It's a bit like a prime minister in a cabinet. The burgemeester is like the prime minister. They're in charge overall. They set the strategy. But beneath them, they have members who are proportional. Their numbers are negotiated. The names are negotiated during the formation of the coalitions, but broadly proportional to the number of seats they've won from the governing parties. And they form the tourism. They give you the tourism échevin or the economy échevin or whoever it is. So that's the idea. There's an important thing about Brussels that's different from what's happening elsewhere in Belgium, which is that in Brussels, the people who can form a coalition form it. In Flanders, the largest party gets the first right of formation, like you do in national governments. But in Brussels, if you're a smaller party and you can find enough other parties to get a majority, go right ahead. That's absolutely fine. So that's where we ended the evening when the votes closed. And what came out of the ballot boxes? Well, In the communes in Brussels, there were quite a few where not much changed. So I'm going to very quickly run through the very boring communes where not much happened. So in Evera, the Parti Socialiste stayed in charge with the new mayor, Rowan Shaid. In Kuckelberg, the leader of the Parti Socialiste in the region, stayed mayor, Ahmed Loesch. In Oudegem, Defi, that Francophone Interest Party, stayed just about in charge with a majority under Sophie de Vos. In Saint-Jost, Emir Kier, a former Parti Socialiste politician who was kicked out for being too friendly with with Turkish mayors who were linked to a far-right movement in Turkey. He won re-election, although it's worth saying that today there was a formal complaint sent in to the police about election interference, and in particular the misuse of votes by procuration of absentee ballots. So that may play out over the next few weeks. Also, super boring. St Lambert's Woluwe Saint Lambert stayed under Olivier Mangin, the founder of Defi, who's been in power for a very long time and is still there. In St Peter's Woluwe and Woluwe Saint Pierre, Benoît Serreche from Les Engagés again stayed as mayor. Hans Hoare, Van Laten stayed as mayor. He was one of the mayors who was elected on what's called a liste bourgmestre. And that's basically an alliance around the existing bourgmestre. And they're often from a particular political colour, but they're called LB because they bring in various other people as well. So Van Laten was a liste bourgmestre from a Les Engagés background, and he has a PS coalition partner, Parti Socialiste. In Jette and Jet, Claire van de Vevere from Liste Bourgmestre made an alliance with MR and Open VLD to stay in office. And in St Gilles as well, Jean Spinet from the Parti Socialiste continued his alliance with the Greens. It's notable because in lots of other parts of Brussels, the Greens did not get a very friendly hearing at the end of the election night. But in St Gilles and Saint Gilles, they stay in power with Jean Spinet, the socialist, as mayor. And then finally in Uccle, down on the southern edge of the city in super 4x4 Range Rover driving territory, Boris Diliès, who is from the Mouvement Réformateur, the sort of liberal conservative party, he stayed in power as well. Some people stayed in power but had a little bit of a switch around of the partners, and that was where we saw some really significant moves on the night as parties who were elected with a particular number of seats rapidly did the maths to work out who was going to be the new mayor. So in Stad-Brussels, in Bruxelles-Ville, the Parti Socialiste, which had previously been allied with the Green Party, decided to switch its alliance from the Green Party to Mouvement Réformateur, but with Philippe Clos still as the Bourgmestre. So one can expect to see in Stad-Brussels probably some changes to the proposals around Good Move. A bit like at regional level, it seems quite likely that the ideas will stay, but the name will change, because Good Move has become a very toxic brand. But PS has taken 5 of the deputy mayorships, 5 of the Eschwina, 5 of the Schepenen, and one of them is mobility. So it's quite likely to stay pretty similar as it is today. MR are going to take the economy. So they're going to be thinking about how do you support small businesses, and that's going to be their focus. And then just down the road in Ixelles and Elsene was possibly the biggest drama of the night, where the Green Party under Christos Doukoulidis won the election, came top, but only just, and an alliance between PS and MR, so Parti Socialiste and Mouvement Réformateur, under Roman de Reume, kicked them out. So it was a really spectacular result. Everyone was expecting the Greens to do badly all across the city, and they did. But in Ixelles, Elsene, they just held on, only to find that behind the scenes, the PS, who'd been their previous allies, had joined up with MR to push them out of power. And that's one of the key stories of the night. The Greens were very much disadvantaged by the post-election playing. Game playing makes it sound negative. It's just politics. But post-election politics was very bad for the Greens. In Anderlecht, Fabrice Kumps, who was the outgoing Burgemeester, actually came second, or his party came second in the vote, but got the exactly same number of seats as Mouvement Réformateur under Van Grootshoven. And because the broad electoral pattern of Anderlecht is quite left, the agreement between PS and MR, between the Parti Socialiste and Mouvement Réformateur, was that even though Kumps had got fewer votes than Van Goitenhoven, Kumps would stay as Burgomaster. So it's still a PS Burgomaster in an alliance with the Liberal Conservative Mouvement Réformateur. Then finally, well, not quite finally, but in another example of the partner change, where the Greens got disadvantaged, in Watermal-Boisfort, the David Lester, who's likely to become the new minister president of the region as a whole, but for now is still just the Burgmestre, has replaced a long-serving Green mayor. So that's switched entirely from a Green-led coalition to a coalition between Mouvement Réformateur and Les Engagés. So the liberal conservatives and the centrist parties have taken over in Watermal-Bosphore. And then finally, like the longest serving of the partner changes was Vincent de Wolf in Etterbeek. He's served 33 years as Burgomaster, which is pretty impressive. He's now got another 6 to go because his Liste Burgomaster formed an alliance with the Parti Socialiste and with Les Engagés, so with the socialists and with the centrists, again kicking out the Greens, who had been his previous allies. And then finally, there's 3 communes which are still in total chaos. The one that is least chaotic is probably Saint-Jans-Molenbeek, Molenbeek-Saint-Jean, where Parti Socialiste came top, and where they will provide the mayor, but they are very likely, for the first time, to go into coalition with PTB-PVDA, with the far left party, which has not been in government in Brussels before. It has been in government in Flanders, in Zelzate, but it has not yet been in government in a Brussels commune. So it is quite likely that PVDA and PS will be the 2 governing parties in Saint-Jans-Molenbeek. It is one of those things where that's pretty much the only combination that works mathematically. So they're in negotiations, and they have not long, about a few more weeks before the time runs out for them to select their Burgomaster. Then in Forst, in Forêt, the obvious coalition would be one that was led by the Mouvement Réformateur, if you exclude the PTB-PVDA, but there is discussion of a Parti Socialiste PTB Green coalition as an anti-Mouvement Réformateur coalition, so a hard left, centre left Green coalition to keep out a right-wing coalition led by Mouvement Réformateur. And then finally, and I won't take too long on this because it's a real soap opera, in Schaerbeek, there was a split in the parties before the vote. So PS and Voorhout did not stand together in Schaerbeek because the PS candidate for Burgomaster was very controversial, and specifically was very controversial because when he was a member of the regional parliament, he had invited a Pakistani imam to read certain verses from the Quran on the floor of the parliament, which is something which a lot of parties got unjustifiably angry is probably the wrong thing to say, because obviously laicite is important, and the secular nature of government is important, but it's not, I think, unfair to say that some people were using it as much as an electoral issue as a real kind of moral crisis. However, that was one of the big problems in Schaerbeek, which led to the split of the two centre left parties who ran separately. The Parti Socialiste won, slightly surprisingly, kicking out Defi, the long-serving mayor. There had been a Defi mayor, and so Hassan Koyuncu, who is the person who is most likely to become mayor, is this controversial figure. The other part of the soap opera was that Seit Kurser, who was elected as a PS Parti Socialiste, a member of the council, switched to Mouvement Réformateur for 24 hours, giving them enough time, or giving them enough seats to claim the mayorship. But then after 24 hours decided he wasn't going to do that. He was going to sit as an independent instead and not sit with Mouvement Réformateur. So we're back to where we started. And there is still negotiations about Hassan Koyuncu being the new mayor of Schaerbeek, but that is all extremely controversial. It's worth saying in the context of Seit Kurser switching sides that a couple of other people have switched sides as well. So in Anderlecht, the majority isn't affected because it's quite a generous majority. But in Anderlecht, we've had 2 people switching. from PS and from MR to Team Fawad Aidar. And in Molenbeek, we've had two people switching the other way, moving from Team Fawad Aidar to other parties. So it's not completely finalised who sits for which party or elected on a list. But if you decide that 3 days after the election you suddenly didn't believe in any of that stuff and you want to move to a different party, I mean, we can criticise it, but the rules allow you to do it. And so a couple of people have done that. So to try and sum up very briefly, what are the big lessons? What's the stuff we saw? Well, the first is DEFI, the Francophone Interest Party, which was set up at a time when there was a lot more community tension, particularly around the edges of Brussels, has really not found a new role in the way that the party landscape sits. It has some big figures. So Bernard Clerfay, who's the guy who just got kicked out as the mayor of Schaerbeek, was one of them. Sophie de Vos and Olivier Manguin are the others, who are the mayors who will continue as mayors in Oudegem and in St. Peter's-Woluwe, in St. Lambrechts-Woluwe. But DEFI overall has had an absolute kicking. It's very unlikely that it's going to survive in its current form. So let's see what happens over the next 6 years, which is the term of the councils. We may see that DEFI merges, changes completely, ceases to exist. There's all sorts of possibilities. It's a very sick party in the sense of, the structure is weak. They had a huge internal row about who the new leader should be. Really difficult situation for them. So that's like story number one, is that the DEFI got an absolute slamming. Also, the Greens went overboard. They did pretty badly. They lost seats across all of the communes where they stood. But they won still in Elsineur, even though the coalition was formed against them. And they were kicked out of coalitions elsewhere. So the Green Party is going to have a bit of a struggle to rebuild itself. But still, it's in a better position than DEFI. It's still the largest Nederlandstalig party. Groen was still the largest Nederlandstalig party and is the leader of the Dutch-speaking government in the Brussels region. So they've got some foundations to build on. But good move has been pretty bad for them, and they need to think about where they come back from. Team Fawad Aidar and PTB PVDA, the other new arrivals. PTB PVDA has been around for a while, but they're going to be new arrivals in communal administration. It'll be really interesting to see how the experience of government and the necessity of making compromises when you're in government is going to work. The experience of Zelzate, which is a very smallish commune in Flanders, is that they stick to the agreements that they make, but they negotiate hard to get those agreements. And they want certain kind of high-profile measures that are very related to their kind of more left-wing agenda. But Team Fawad Aidar does not look like it's going to go into coalition in any of the communes. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that it's associated with an electoral offer that's very strongly focused on the Muslim communities. And although that's not a problem in itself, I think several of the parties feel a little bit nervous about associating or creating links with a party that can be accused of communitarianism, of looking just to get out the community vote. Although to some extent that's unfair, because if you look down the party lists, they're really cross-community, cross-cultural, partly because the electoral system and the list system encourages people to go and vote for people who come from similar backgrounds to them or who have similar interests to them. And so there's quite a lot of hypocrisy in those conversations. But it is also true that the socialist parties, which is where Fawad Aidar comes from as an individual, are unlikely to go into coalition with someone that they see as having stabbed them in the back and left the party and set up his own party for his own personal interests. So they are likely to stay outside government, but we'll see what happens in 6 years' time, if they're just a flash in the pan or if they're going to stay around for a while. And the other thing, which is slightly surprising, is the number of Dutch-speaking councillors went down. And in particular, N-VA lost all of the 6 seats it had, and Vlaams Belang wasn't expected to win any and didn't win any. So you now have no only Dutch-speaking parties represented in any of the communes. And although there are Dutch-speaking conseillers communal, and there will be Dutch-speaking échevins scaper, for example, Anaïs Mas in Stad-Brussels, Ville de Bruxelles, you do have this sense now that the future in Brussels will be 100% bilingual lists, and that trying to set up a kind of a monolingual list either on the French side or on the Dutch-speaking side in a city that's so multilingual is, you're just putting yourself in a very bad position from the start. So it looks like the future is really going to be bilingual lists. And the final thing to say is that there were not significant moves in terms of the main parties. So the Parti Socialiste stayed pretty stable, kept the same number of mayors. The MR, Mouvement Réformateur, made a little bit of progress. Les Engagés made a little bit of progress. But compared to the huge changes that we saw in Wallonie, where the Parti Socialiste lost control of both the Wallon regional government and the Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles, that looks after cultural and education issues in Brussels as well, to an MR Engagé coalition, you would have expected potentially a bit more of a blue wave in Brussels region for the communal elections. It didn't happen. The Parti Socialiste stood pretty strong, and I think, to everyone's surprise, not least their own, they've ended up with pretty much the same representation in terms of mayors and in terms of seats around the different communes that we had before. So that's a kind of no change, but it's a no change that I don't think anyone was really expecting, because I think they were expecting to see much more of a move to the centre-right parties that we'd seen in the June elections. So I hope that's helpful. As I say, I've gone through everything a little bit, but really happy to take questions insofar as I can. I should say, for like full declaration, I'm a member of the Parti Socialiste. I live in Brussels, so that's what I understand best. But always happy to give impartial and hopefully thought-provoking ideas and thoughts on any of the other communes to the extent that I know them.
Thanks so much, Anthony. I think you managed to cover as much ground as possible in just a short amount of time. For everybody who's joining us, you can use either a QR code that put up on the screen, or you can use a link to ask your questions via Slido. I saw that we already had two come in. But I'll also just take this opportunity to maybe ask a question of my first, which is related to one of the questions asked by Kilian in the audience, which is that I feel like there's always this effort post-election to kind of find these grand narratives that explain the outcome. And so one of the things, and you also talked about this, was sort of the downfall of the Greens. And I'm wondering if you can maybe speak a little bit about whether you think that this is maybe more based on party or topics, and if so, you could give us a sense of what some of the main topics were that catalyzed voters to maybe go in one direction or the other, even if some of the established parties, as you rightly pointed out, didn't maybe see as much of a change in the percentages compared to the federal regional level. And then in relation to this, Kilian asked about the context in Excel, specifically asking why were the Greens so isolated in post-election politics, and did they make so many enemies? I imagine that this has a lot to do with the coalition building that we saw after the fact. We have some more questions, but I'll leave it at these two for the start.
Well, they're both really good questions. I think the first thing to say is that people vote for all sorts of reasons, and obviously you can never look behind the reason that they vote the way they do. It seems likely that a couple of issues were prominent. The first is mobility, and Good Move was, to me, surprisingly unpopular. It had created particular tensions in particular parts of the city. In the centre, in the Pentagon where I live, it was not so controversial, but in Schaerbeek, in Kuregem, and other places, it was really controversial. And so I think that hurt the Greens. I think the Greens also do have a tendency, and this is not just a Brussels thing, you see it everywhere. When they are in government for a while, they tend to get punished afterwards. They get blamed for, whatever it is, like, woke or mobility or finger wagging climate policies or telling people off. All this kind of thing really gets attached to the Greens in every context. Yeah, in Germany, the Greens are sometimes called a Verbot party, like forbidding party, as in like you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do this. So there's maybe some of that. I think the other aspect that I think was particularly prominent in Stad Brussels, in Ville de Bruxelles, was security. There's definitely been a big shift of the drugs trade from Antwerp into Brussels, and in particular the fighting that's going on around turf wars between different gangs trying to establish control of the cocaine trade in Brussels has been pretty negative for people's sense of security. It's obviously negative for security in general, but it is kind of relatively contained. But then drug use and homelessness, and in particular the pressure on migration, I think that hurt PS in some places. But it was certainly an argument that Mouvement Réformateur made in a lot of areas, that they needed stronger lines, harder lines, making sure that people were following the rules, and that kind of security dialogue was also, I think, one of the reasons that people were perhaps a little bit, the city went a bit bluer overall than it had done in the past. In terms of the what happened to the Greens and why did they get kicked out? I mean, there's the cynical answer and there's the slightly less cynical answer. The cynical answer, or the argument is, well, the Greens got punished by the voters, and so who's going to ally with a party that's been given a kicking by the voters? Because then some of that voter disquiet gets on you. So if you're a member of PS or if you're a burgemeester for PS, then it's not too difficult a choice. If the Greens have lost seats and the Mouvement Réformateur have gained them, to say, well, it's the will of the voters that we should ally with the Mouvement Réformateur and get rid of the Greens. It's particularly notable in Ixelles-Elseneur that happened even though the Greens led the poll. And I think that one can make the argument in places where the Greens came third and Mouvement Réformateur came second, that okay, the vote swing was towards MR and therefore they probably should be the coalition partner. But still, in Ixelles-Elseneur, I think it was a little bit more the numbers worked for the PS to get power that way, and so they did. And I think they may or may not get punished for it in 6 years' time. Perhaps perhaps the voters of Elseneur have longer memories than I think they do. My expectation is that it won't particularly be registering on people's opinions in 6 years' time, not least because Elseneur has a very mobile population. People move in, people move out. A lot of people vote there for the first time. And so it doesn't have such a stable population as places like Uccle or the two Waterways.
Thanks so much. We have one more question about a different commune, namely Etterbeek. And the question is, was Etterbeek always a done deal? Was there a point in voting when our king was always going to get his crown? So, so in addition to that, I'm also wondering if you can maybe share a little bit more about what your impression was in terms of the impact of the international vote. Because something that we, of course, saw was that, in a very short amount of time, we kind of saw this domino effect of parties realizing, oh, this is another population among the broader voter population that we can invest in, where outreach pays off. And so can you maybe kind of, in case you have data or can you maybe talk a little bit more about that and maybe also compare it to last time around, because I'm sure that for a lot of people listening in, it would be interesting to see.
On topic of Vincent de Wolf in Etterbeek, well, on the one hand, voting really mattered because you got rid of one of the coalition parties and he brought in some others. It is certainly true that the burgomaster in Belgian politics, particularly at communal level, and particularly in Brussels where communes are pretty small, I mean the smallest commune in all of Belgium, other than those that have particular legal restrictions because of language rules, is Sint-Jost, which is like really tiny, and Sint-Agnes-Berchem and others are equally small. So I think there is a personality issue. So you have like long-serving burgomaster who are there, who like open all, cut every ribbon, shake hands with every voter. They're really, really prominent in that role. And Vincent de Wolf is definitely one of those. Philippe Clos is as well in Brussels to some extent. And I think that in those contexts, yes, you're pretty much certain you're going to get Vincent de Wolf. It's a pretty safe vote for him. It's safe to say that he'll come out on top. But at the same time, the behind the scenes, because it's a semi-proportional system with the Imperiale system, you do get changes in people. So if you'd voted for Green rather than MR, or if 1,000 people had voted for Green rather than MR, it would still be a Green coalition in Etterbeek, and now it isn't. So those things behind the scenes can change. the burgemeesterschap is definitely something that's a little bit more stable. One of the reasons why Fabrice Kumps held on to the role in Anderlecht is because he had been doing it for years and people knew him, and he was like a representative of the commune. So yeah, that's kind of the Belgian system. It's pretty conservative with those changes of personnel. In the context of the international vote, I'm afraid I don't have statistics on that. I should have thought, given who I was speaking to, that I should have looked them up beforehand. I think the answer to the question is the international vote is several different sorts of international vote. I think it's fair to say. There's the people who are like relatively recent arrivals and who are voting for the first time, or who have only just registered and have voted for the first time. I think the numbers of those are really are more significant in places like, in fact, in places like Etterbeek, which are relatively small communes with relatively large populations of, let's call these people expats. And then there's others who are non-Belgian citizens of longer-term residence, and those are people, for example, in Schaerbeek, or in places where there are strong representations from countries that don't allow you to have double citizenship, and so they've kept often their citizenship of birth while having permanent residence here. And it's really noticeable that in some of those communes, you did see a very strong vote for particular people, particular groups who had been, or groups of councillors who were very prominent. And if you walk around Brussels, for example, it's really clear that there's a group of shops that have links to the Chinese or East Asian community, and there were a couple of candidates from that community for MR, and their candidate photos were everywhere on the shops, and no one else's was. And then you walk a few streets away, and it's more of a Turkish neighbourhood, and you see Turkish candidate names plus the Burgmeester's name, or the list leader Lijsttrekker's name. So it is a thing that happens where these international voices are more effective politically the longer they're established. I think one of the interesting things for Restless Brussels and for the international registration campaigns for future elections is whether we can build on and start to understand how, with a pretty, pretty smart, pretty articulate, pretty well-connected group of people in the Restless Brussels network, there is the possibility of pushing some of those messages a little bit harder, or a little bit further, which comes from the politicians knowing that this group, even if not each individual member, is going to be around for a long time, and that it's in their interests to stay engaged with it.
Great, thanks so much. I know that Adriano has a question, so go ahead, and then we have one more from the audience.
Yes, thanks for the explanation. Very interesting. And I wanted to ask actually if we are gonna see some changes, especially in terms of mobility at the commune level, before the government of a Brussels level is formed. I know mobility was one of the topics that was the most discussed one, but then I wonder if we will see effectively some changes before the government is formed at that level.
It's quite possible that you will, but it's worth remembering that the control of mobility is divided between the region and the commune. So if you look up on the street signs and you see that little Brussels flower symbol, the iris, that means it's a regional road, so it's not in the control of the commune. So your commune will not be able to do anything about what the traffic arrangements are on that road. In the streets around it, you may see potentially some reduction in traffic calming measures, or some traffic calming plans being put back or being changed. I think a lot of it will depend on the direction that's set by the region still. So I suspect we will not have too much longer to wait before we get a government at regional level. Certainly the Francophone side, and particularly David Lester and Georges-Louis Boucher, the leader of MR, have been pushing the Dutch-speaking parties very hard to move forward. And if that happens, then I think we'll see, probably by the end of November, middle of December, we'll see a government at regional level, and then there'll be conversations going on about what happens on mobility. You may see some small changes now. My guess is that unless it was like a real platform in the local election, it was a real issue for the winning party, which may be the case in, for example, Watermal Bosvoorde, where you have the MR replacing the Greens. I think in places like that, you may well see some immediate changes. I know that there was a proposal in Elsene Excel to make some one-way streets two-way. Small things like that could change quite rapidly. But the bigger stuff, I suspect people will wait on the regional elections, regional government.
Thanks. We have one more question that kind of relates to this by Christina from Scalbeek. You say that Good Move will likely get a rebrand. Is that true everywhere, or will it likely be trashed in some places? And then we also have questions from Johanna. In order to get more expats involved in the next local elections, would it be an idea to start campaigning already now for people to register to vote? Is it actually possible to register already? And then secondly, how do you see opportunities for expats getting to vote in the regional elections one day?
So it's three questions, three important questions there. Let me start with the voting rights. The vote in the regional elections requires a state reform, so it requires a constitutional reform. It's not impossible, but it is complicated. So the way that the state reform works is that you have to unlock articles of the constitution in one parliament and then change them in the next with a majority of 2/3, which sounds reasonably straightforward. But if you exclude the far right and the far left, you basically have 2/3. So you have to get every single mainstream party to agree, and that's not impossible, but it's difficult. And so I would imagine that like regional or national voting for long-term residents is probably not the biggest thing that will be discussed if there is a state reform, but it might happen. But if it happens, it'll happen through a state reform. So I suspect chances are maybe like 30%, because at the moment the issues around state reforms are being discussed as part of the coalition forming at national level, but the priority for the next 2 to 3 years is going to be on socioeconomic taxation, welfare state, budget, cleaning up the budgets, in the words of the probable government. So that sort of stuff will probably be on the back burner. Doesn't mean you can't campaign for it. In fact, probably now is the time to campaign for it, but you won't see movement on it for maybe 2 or 3 years. In terms of the registering to vote, I think you can register to vote whenever. I think obviously, if you think you might move in the next 6 years, then don't bother, because you'll just need to re-register when you do. But I think it's certainly possible to start building a campaign for that. I think it's also worth saying that each of the communes is going to have its own approach to involving citizens. So there's no reason that you can't put community groups together or put kind of campaigns or forums together where people can meet and talk, and you can demonstrate the connection and the possibilities that this group has in terms of influencing local politicians and getting them on board. English is so much a lingua franca these days. For I worry about it a little. There's so much a lingua franca in different kind of Brussels bodies. I don't think you'll find it too hard to find a Echevin Scaper who has the right level of English. And then as for Good Move, I think it's fair to say that Good Move has a much worse reputation than it deserves. Right? I'm not a Green voter, although I'm very concerned on climate issues, and it's one of the areas that I work on professionally. But for me, Good Move was really the very least that you would want to do to change the mobility in Brussels. Things like the taxe kilométrique, the mileage tax for people coming from outside the region, I think are much more important, and I don't think are going to go anywhere now because of the blockage that happened on Good Move. I suspect that what will happen is that, as with all of these, as with many of these local changes, nothing much will change that is already in place, because it's already in place and it's a lot of hassle to get rid of it, except for a few symbolic things like those two-way streets. But more generally, the mobility plan will still focus on reducing carbon, because that's a requirement that the federal government has put on the regions and that Europe puts on us as well. We'll still focus on favouring mobilité douce, things like bicycles and metros and buses and trams ahead of car traffic, particularly in the urban core. But yes, I think it will not be called Good Move, because I think it has got a really bad reputation. As I say, a bit undeserved, but it's really going to be a decision for Elke van der Brandt and for the new government at regional level, who's going to get the mobility brief. Because if it's MR who get the mobility brief, they will want to have a few. They'll want to slaughter a few sacrificial good move initiatives. But it doesn't mean to say that you won't see a continuing tendency away from car-based traffic and towards more green means of transport. They may just do it while not talking about it very much.
Thanks so much, Anthony. This was very, very useful. And I think we have a lot of things to look out for, and certainly also to think about. I think we've made very good use of our time. To everyone who's tuning in, this is of course the first event that we've done after the municipal elections, the communal elections, and we're essentially planning our activities for the coming months. And so we encourage you to keep an eye out. We'll obviously be informing you via the established channels. There's also still ways, in case you aren't already following us, for you to do so. So thanks again, Anthony, for joining us. We look forward to staying in touch around this, and to all of you, have a very nice evening and hopefully see you at one of our upcoming events.